The angles aren't real great on this. I've got the iPad here for the WebEx, and I've got the laptop for a few opening remarks I'm going to make, which the Secretariat will hate my guts for because I decided to do it last night and haven't sent them through them, but hopefully the committee will be happy they're short.
All right, good stuff. Well, in that case, I'll do the official bit. So I now welcome Mr. Peter Harris, who is attending via video conference, and I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you, Mr. Harris. For the Hansard record, if you could please state your name in full and the capacity in which you appear today.
I'm Peter Harris. I have formerly been responsible for transport policy in the 1990s out of the department, including the development of the original slot scheme and the Act and regulations that supported it. In 2020, I was asked, so I retired from the Australian government at the end of 2018. In 2020, I was asked by the department to come back and review the scheme as it stood, because the Productivity Commission, which was my former home between 2013 and 2018, had recommended in 2019 that there be a further review of the scheme related to some aspects of it which the Productivity Commission had expressed doubts about in terms of the impact on efficiency at Sydney Airport. The department, when asking me to do this, pointed out that the legislation was due to sunset in 2024 and therefore asked me could I make sure that the report effectively addressed the kind of review that has to take place before sunsetting regulation is renewed. So I did that. I did that over a period of about 3 or 4 months at the end of 2020 and January 21, and completed this report, I think, in the first week of February 21. And the department had published it at some later point. I should clarify for the committee, I haven't been engaged by the department since then in any sense.
Wow.
And have not had any role in the development of this legislation. But I have reread the report in the last few days just to familiarise myself, and I looked at the bill that's in front of you, a few other things, and I can see some clear linkages between the report and the legislation that's in front of you today. In terms of my opening statement, that was the bulk of what I was going to say to you anyway, Senator, if I could. But the bottom line is the report I made to the government in 2021 showed that the scheme, because it had been set in regulation rather than, as is the case for most capacity-constrained airports around the world, developed via a cooperative scheme that then can evolve, because our regulation was fixed, this scheme has not evolved since 1997. It's a very long time. And as a consequence, I pointed out to the government that the regional ring fence that's protected regional access to Sydney Airport had only done so at an unexpected cost of poorer quality choices for starting new regional services or improving schedules. And that's because a fence not only keeps predators out, but it keeps the protected stock in, if you like. There had been stranding of slots inside the ring fence that could not practically be accessed by any airline, making the airport less efficient than it could be and potentially reducing employment and investment in associated dependent industries like tourism. That we used a priority system in allocating slots amongst applicants that was world leading at the time in 1997, but today gives much weaker support to new competition than occurs at similar capacity constrained airports around the world. We leave too much responsibility in the scheme on the question of ensuring airlines comply with their obligations under the capping process to a form of self-regulation managed by the Compliance Committee that is weaker again than occurs now at Sydney Airport, similar airports around the world. We have an operational cap applied by Air Services Australia every 15 minutes, which creates an unnecessary delay to passengers with no reduction in noise impacts. Was put in place originally to ensure that airlines respected the compliance process, but is unnecessary today. And finally, because of that construct, we prevented Air Services Australia from having opportunities to assist the airport to recover from security or weather shocks. So those are the primary elements in my report to the government. Not being the author of the legislation, I'm not here to answer specifically for it, but I can see some substantial similarities to some of the things that I had recommended.
Thank you, Mr Harris. And the biggest issues for Sydney Airport?
I think the biggest issue for Sydney Airport is to maintain community support. And this is, I think this is a little bit of a shock to people who today look at a highly regulated scheme for access like we have at the airport and think that it's probably unnecessary now. The community definitely demanded it in 1996-97 when we were developing the original scheme. There was a substantial amount of opposition to it and queries as to whether or not it would actually help to manage flows, in other words, to enable air traffic control to switch the airport around at times of lesser movements, to share the noise, as it were, across the Sydney Basin. It's pretty clear now that though the community demanded a regulatory structure in 1996 and 97, the value in preserving it today, which I did say in my report should happen, is primarily because the community has accepted that the scheme does help to manage aircraft noise and enables, therefore, this balance of cooperative existence to occur between people who are affected by aircraft noise and consumers and businesses that supply them that need access to the airport.
And Mr Harris, why is Sydney Airport so important to our aviation network?
Most of what happens in aviation Australia keys off Sydney Airport. Not everything, and there are other airports which would say they were substantially as important as Sydney Airport. But certainly for international access, it's the primary gateway that every international airline wants because it's easy to promote overseas. It's also an inner-city airport, therefore it's very convenient for tourists coming to Australia, and it creates that, I guess, that leverage that you need as a tourism destination. Point out that we have access available for new entrants, international new entrants, to obtain the ability to operate to our premier gateway in circumstances where some of the other very important, what I call tourism, but capacity-constrained airports around the world often don't. I think I heard in some of the comments that you were asking ACA a little earlier about the nature of slot allocation at Heathrow, and that's a good example. We have the capacity, transparently, to give internationals access and to Sydney, and that's quite important. It's not to say the government must give access, but the government can demonstrate that it has an objective process for ensuring you do get access.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And the same is true for domestic competition, I might say, as well. That's not to say the scheme isn't clunky. If you read my report, you'll see we did the best job we could in 1997, but we're substantially out of date. Other schemes around the world, which weren't mostly in evidence as formal schemes in 1997, have developed and surpassed our scheme, and thus we need to update this legislation, lest otherwise we are, amongst other things, offering less access for competition and less ability for Air Services Australia to flex the system while still respecting the 80 cap.
That message is coming through loud and clear from most of the witnesses today. That's correct. So how does this bill go in addressing the issues you found?
My impression is it's pretty good. I'm not a lawyer, and so the hardest thing when reviewing legislation is to take the policy concept that you have in mind and think, I can't see it written down here in a black and white sense. But a lot of the scheme is going to come through subordinate legislation, through regulation. That's going to be important. Obviously, that gets reviewed as well. The Senate has a role in looking at that when it comes along. I think it will certainly deliver an improvement to competition, and it will deliver an improvement to transparency. I did see you asked ACA about transparency, and my report has some comments on that, because we aren't terribly transparent in terms of showing up on a website where slots are available and making a calculation easy online. I think ACA referred to the fact that airlines meet with them But a mechanism should be available, and the report did recommend this, in which an airline can, in the comfort of its own commercially protected circumstances, run scenarios about what slots are available and what slots aren't available, and that should be available online and is an important investment. This legislation, as I understand it, will provide a basis for a minister to ensure that that occurs in the future. The penalties regime is sort of important. I've always been, in a regulatory sense, less confident about penalties as an incentive for good behaviour and far more confident about exposure. And because I think exposure really matters here, and particularly in a circumstance where, I come back to your opening question, Senator, what's most important at Sydney Airport is the continued support of the community. If the community thinks that slot management scheme is being gained, and today maybe they don't, but if they do decide that, it's a very bad outcome for airlines and airports. And so the question of penalties, I guess, is important as an incentive, but obviously for preference, it's a bit like the road laws. You know, we'd like to see nobody fined, but you've got to have some kind of incentive there for them. And the final and largest thing for me, which I think will be made available under this bill and subordinate legislation, is the messaging to Air Services Australia that it no longer has to use the 15-minute cap process to ensure that the airport can never go past 80. It just has to do it in circumstances where an independent party has declared that there's been a serious incident, whether security, IT outage, something like that, and Air Services is able, if services can present themselves in time, to start running at maybe 80, 81, 82 per hour. But there is data in my my report to indicate that the numbers are unlikely to be much higher than that. It's just that Air Services Australia, in my strong view, needs permission to try to do this, so that a few hundred more people might get home after an incident rather than have to be housed overnight in Sydney and have their lives disrupted. When I was doing the report, and I sort of envisaged this idea, I sort of mentally created it because the Productivity Commission report had pointed to this 15-minute window and said something should be done about it. It's an impediment to efficiency. And I was thinking, well, the particular impediment it is to flexibility for air traffic control. And so we did investigate the likelihood of getting a larger number of movements, and you can see in my report it's a relatively rare event where we'll have both, a security or weather-related event, and subsequently be presented with an hour in which there were roughly 80 movements coming down the pipe, and they were all still available after the incident. It's going to be a relatively rare event, but the flexibility should be available to air traffic control to attempt to do this, and I think that's what makes it deeply desirable.
Thanks, Mr Harrison. Sorry, keep going.
I was just going to say, I tried this on the community reps. You'll see from my report, we didn't just ask for submissions, we actually contacted all the people that we thought in 2020, late 2020, were still relevant to the noise forums and the local community groups and the regional organisation of councils and all that kind of thing. And I floated the idea past them. And there's no doubt people were initially suspicious. What could this mean? But when I pointed out no extra movement can occur in that day, no extra movement can occur. The movements actually have to be already scheduled and either on the ground ready to go in the air in order for them to even take some possible advantage of recovery mode. And thus there is no additional noise from this kind of mechanism. And the reaction of community groups was, broadly speaking, common sense. Just common sense. In fact, I remember one of them in particular, I won't be able to identify him with the elapse of time, said to me, I thought that already happened. And I said, no, Air Services Australia is very, very explicit about keeping to the cap on this rolling 15-minute operating arrangement.
Right, thanks, Mr Harrison. Just my final one, and I think this might have been one of your considerations, but can you talk us through the need to balance the impacts on the communities on the ground?
I think the most important thing with Sydney Airport is that we continue this consultation arrangement that's been in place now for a long period and accept that this is a capacity-constrained airport in part because of noise considerations. And that has been well accepted. And as I said in the report, compared with the way we were in 1996-97 with the level of community angst and outrage after the opening of the second parallel runway and a presumption that we were going to run 120 movements per hour down it continuously, the community has come around. I won't say the community cheers or supports everything that is done at the airport, but we have, I think, when I say we, the airport, the airlines, community consultation process, the government and both political persuasions has preserved a level of cooperative behaviour, and I think these amendments are designed for that very purpose as well. Don't change the 80 cap other than in that very explicit set of circumstances called recovery mode. We want that published as in close to real time so that communities know even if that we did exceed 80. And I'd like to know too, just as a general observer, but that's the most important thing. These changes will not jeopardise the 80 cap.
Okay. Thank you, Mr Harris. Senator Mackenzie.
Thank you. Lovely to see you, Mr Harris. I think one of the things that has come through in our consultation today is the lack of consultation with the impacted community in the development of this legislation between the announcement it's going to happen in February and the legislation before us. And that is in stark contrast, and other witnesses have made reference to the fact that the consultation process that you undertook embedded that existing community forum into consultation processes around looking at this type of thing. So I think that is a very sound recommendation to come out of this inquiry. You've talked about the key findings and how this bill seems to be in the spirit, shall we say, of your much championed 21 review into the slot system. Are there things, what would be most critical? Is it the transparency piece for that social licence, for the sort of issues? And we've seen the ACCC today be looking at the increase in air prices, etc., the lack of competition. Is it the transparency piece that's most important?
In my view, it is. It's the only place to start every time we do something in a regulatory sense that involves Sydney Airport, is to think first, how will this affect the community? And if it looks, as it often is, hideously complicated and uncertain, how will we explain it? Our approach in doing the review, as I said, wasn't just to call for submissions. We actually tracked people down, rang them, asked for... Now, it's in COVID, so people were perhaps more amenable to being tracked down and interviewed over the phone, or I think we did a couple of FaceTimes, but I wasn't that happy with FaceTime myself. It was mainly phone discussions, and people were amenable to that. And as I said, there's a degree of suspicion every time you're proposing a change, and understandably so. But as long as you've got your story straight, what I found was acceptance of common sense.
Yeah.
Just have to help people see how these changes are about common sense, and particularly if they're about marginal shifts. Even the regional ring fence shift, which was in my report, which I mentioned earlier, the idea of changing the peak hours, even that change, when talking to regional councils and regional communities, and people initially said, oh, but this is really a great benefit to us. And when I pointed out, well, you used to have 50-odd ports interacting out of New South Wales with Sydney Airport, and you're down to 20-odd now. So over time, notwithstanding this ring fence, you've had a decline, but in part that's explained by the fact that to make yourself commercially sustainable, people have to fly from a fewer number of airports in slightly larger aircraft to utilise access to Sydney. And I explained that what you've got now is a ring fence that is not just protecting you from not having regional slots stolen by your affiliates under various persuasive mechanisms that move across to to the larger carriers, which is what we were afraid of in 96, 97 might occur, and thus the ring fence was created. It's not that, because history shows that simply hasn't happened. What's happened instead is the ring fence has actually kept you in, but you have slots in there which regional carriers are now showing they simply can't use. They can't move more than half an hour at a time, and so it becomes a laborious process to try and line themselves up. So what I have proposed in my report is a priority for regional movements as first part of this change. Gives regional carriers the ability to come up with a much better schedule, and for ACA to give them, or whoever is running the scheme by after the tender is completed, have an ability to give regionals the chance to fix up their schedules first before other allocations take place.
One of your former roles as the Productivity Commission Chair gives you a unique insight. We call the competition czars, former, and yourself, because you do bring a unique cumulative perspective to this type of discussion. And one of the things I've been interested in is this particular framework's impact on productivity. Businesses, because it seems airlines game the system, right? They're not doing anything illegal, they're operating within the rules, but they're maximising their market share, they're maximising their return, etc. The subsequent productivity issues around businesses building in to travel delays, overnight stays, etc. We heard from Canberra Airport this morning about, they've got sort of 4 after 4 flights going from Canberra to Sydney, sort of all 20 minutes apart, to deal with everyone that's come to town for business and needs to get home. And inevitably they get cancelled and collapsed to sort of, provide relief in other areas of Qantas's network. So I'm just wondering if you could broadly speak to the drain on productivity of a system that does seem to be.
Yep, I can do that.
Yep.
The primary productivity cost is not one that you mentioned, Senator, although we'll come to the ones you have mentioned. The primary productivity cost is these stranded slots, because some of them are in very attractive locations, and this is why changing the definition of the peak hour, particularly freeing up the 6 to 7 a.m. peak hour, which isn't being used heavily by regional carriers anymore, but giving the regional carriers the ability to gain priority in the 7 to 8 a.m. area, for example, as a quid pro quo for that.
Yep.
That's a productivity benefit for the airport, for new competition, so it's an induced kind of productivity benefit through competition. That's the area, I think, of primary gain. It is a secondary but still potentially real gain that airlines might choose to operate a fleet of smaller aircraft in order to occupy slots and prevent their competitors from occupying them. However, it's very difficult to call that slot hoarding in a sense that makes it an unreasonable thing. Think of the alternative. Airline turns up, says, I really want to offer our consumers very rapid, just like a bus, you don't even have to know the timetable, just turn up and you can get on a plane kind of thing. Who is the regulator to say, don't do that? So it's very hard to prove. I did recommend, and I understand it's underway, I haven't seen the result of it, but I did recommend that because of this continuing concern that Canberra Airport has mentioned, but others have mentioned too, about is this a practice of slot hoarding, that getting a forensic accountant kind of approach to reviewing the rationales for cancellations in those slots would be a desirable thing. I did recommend that. I understand it's underway, and it may be that as a consequence of such a review and the other changes to compliance, we'll see the schedules change a little. And therefore you might see a better utilisation of aircraft. Whether you'll see a better utilisation of slots is entirely open. Somebody else has to want to take up that slot. That's the crucial thing in order to guarantee that there will be a better utilisation of slots. But you might get a better utilisation of aircraft, and through that you'll get a productivity gain as well.
Okay, thank you. You called the recovery period, and I quote, the largest single efficiency measure available to government. Is that still your view? There's been some criticism of that to the committee, and I just wanted to get your perspective.
Yeah, I'm not aware of what the criticism is, so it's sort of hard to respond to. But to me, this ability for Air Services Australia to move a couple of hundred people home after an incident that wouldn't have otherwise been able to move because of the nature of operating caps, I think that is the largest single benefit that's available in an overall benefit sense, if you like. I'm not saying it's the greatest single way to make the airport work better or airlines' lives easier or anything else. It's just that there is no additional movement that's going to take place. Therefore, the 80 cap is not under threat. But we can give Air Services flexibility to behave in a manner that tries to help people out of a hole that was created by circumstances beyond their control. So that's the reason I prefer those kinds of changes to some of the other more radical and interesting things in my report, even though I was given a clear remit that says the 80 cap won't change. There were a number of parties who offered up ideas for how to, in practice, change the 80 cap a little bit. And I went through explaining why those would be a challenge. And it's particularly because the way I view this, the airport community have come to terms around a regulated scheme that preserves 80.
Yep.
So the community is prepared to offer you common sense that might involve you going past 80 in an hour or maybe 2 hours. That's such a desirable thing to take up. It should create confidence for the future for some similar change, which undoubtedly, this won't be the last time, hopefully, that we change this scheme. So that, to me, is why it's the most important thing that could occur.
And just my final question. So in terms of enhancing competition, do you believe there needs to be more churn of slots to encourage that rather than a sort of set and forget operation that we seem to have at the moment?
No, I would not go down the churn path.
Okay.
I would not do that. I mean, and the reason is we have to recognise that airlines, and this is particularly true of airlines just starting up. I mean, I think in Australia we imagine that because Qantas has got so many slots they can afford to give some up, as it were. But the regulatory scheme would have to apply to all the airlines, and for quite a number of airlines that only have, particularly internationals, that only have a relatively small number of slots, the idea that there's some kind of regulated churn arrangement doesn't seem to me to be at all sensible. I do not know how you go about even calculating it.
Okay.
And it would make life miserable for anybody trying to promote tourism into Australia.
Yeah,
in my
and
view.
connecting flights.
Thank you. No, I'll leave it.
Yeah, Senator Colbeck.
Thanks, Chair. Look, just a couple of things. And I think the balance between movement and the relationship with the constituency immediately around the airport probably covers this off to a certain extent, but the bill proposes an additional 5 slots in the recovery period. You talk 5 to 7. I was just interested in your process to land on that as an additional catch-up. So you're talking in the context of the bill over a 2-hour recovery period, an extra 10 slots. How that assists in practice and its adequacy, and why you landed at 5 to 7.
Okay. My report indicates where 5 to 7 came from. It's because, Senator, there are many estimates that float around about what the real unconstrained capacity of Sydney Airport would be. I referred earlier to back in the 90s when it was proclaimed that we could do 120 movements an hour. I think it's been comprehensively demonstrated through subsequent reviews that's not plausible, but someone should ask Air Services Australia, and they're much more expert in this than I am. But the best review that we could uncover doing our inquiry was from 2012, where there was a consideration given to what you could do if you were able to run air traffic control whilst still maintaining noise sharing arrangements, what you could do at Sydney Airport. And the estimate at that time was you might, in constrained circumstances of a perfect nature, be able to, and perfect nature means the planes are ready to present, everyone's loaded, all that kind of thing, you might be able to get 5 to 7 extra movements per hour. So we put that in really as an indication to the community that we're not talking in these couple of hours of recovery mode about anything massive. We're not talking about going to 120 or anything like that, because it's not plausible.
Yeah.
It's simply not plausible. You can't forecast this incident, but this incident occurs, so you've got what you've got in the next hour. Maybe it'll be one of those hours where magically there's 78 movements already scheduled and they're all available, and you've got a few held on the ground during the incident. Let them go early, and maybe you'll end up with 81 or 82 in that first hour. It's that level of flex that we're talking about here, nothing more than that. And as I said, the general response after having you explained when I was doing my consultations was that's just common sense. And I think it's right. It is just common sense. But if we did get, let's be being really right out there in terms of hopefulness about this, let's get an extra, if we say we get an extra 10 movements over a 2-hour period, roughly speaking, that's 2,000 people who got home or got to where they wanted to go that weren't otherwise going to do so. And that's the desirable thing here, that we help them out in this circumstance. We enable this legislation and the experts managing at Air Services Australia to have the option of flex, and we get permission. That's what you're really going to get if you do go down this path. We're really offering Air Services Australia permission to transparently report, but permission to try and do recovery a bit more efficiently than they're allowed to do at the moment.
Okay, well, that very much lines up with the evidence that you've given already.
In terms of the Compliance Committee representation, we had a conversation with the agents earlier, and in the context of everybody's confidence about the system is working as it should work and designed, they were very interested in being represented on that Compliance Committee and providing their expertise. How about consumers, or the community of the airport, so the people are being impacted, the ones that you've spent time talking to, assuring that this is in practice how it's going to work? Because I think your point around maintaining community confidence and the relationship with the airport is a really good one and an important one as a part of the overall social licence.
I wouldn't recommend, Senator, that the Compliance Committee has such representation, because the real purpose of the Compliance Committee is to have enough expertise to, if you like, challenge an airline who says, well, what I was doing was entirely reasonable. So it comes down to legal and aviation expertise for that committee, and I had recommended actually that it have an independent chair of a legal background to control that process better than the design we put in place in '97, which admittedly has not functioned as we expected it. We just made it too much of a cooperative scheme and too little of a genuine compliance mechanism. But what I would say is, if you are thinking of community representation, there is going to be a board for the slot manager. You might want to think about that arrangement. The board for the slot manager might have ex officio added to it, somebody who can, if you like, develop expertise themselves in what the slot management process actually is, because it looks a bit of a mystery and yet it's really quite important to the community. So I would probably suggest you look at the overall governance of the arrangements rather than look at the Compliance Committee. The vital thing for the Compliance Committee is that we strengthen it sufficiently so that, you know, we don't have to go down the path of trying to find people. We make it very obvious that there'll be ritual public humiliation before fines arrive, and it'll be led by somebody who's got, you know, a serious legal presence, therefore likely to be respected above and beyond perhaps the claims of individual airline executives.
And so you see that part of the overall process being an important point in maintaining the element of community acceptance that the system's actually working as it.
I think something that helps the community realise that this scheme is intended to work for them as much as it is intended to work for the airlines would be desirable.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Senator Colbeck. Mr Harris, thank you very much for your evidence.